"Ma'am," the twins whispered so softly that their words almost dissolved into the noise of the room, yet somehow they still cut through the chaos as they said, "We know what's wrong and we can fix it." Kimberly Caldwell glanced down, ready to snap, because her company was collapsing in front of her eyes. $3 billion were disappearing by the second. 10 highly paid experts had already failed to stop the damage, and now 2 8-year-old girls with matching ginger curls were interrupting the worst moment of her professional life. Children, actual children, claiming that they could solve the problem that some of the top minds in the industry could not even contain. In that instant, every instinct she had sharpened over years of leadership told her that this was ridiculous and that security protocols were being shredded. Yet beneath the anger and disbelief sat a cold, simple truth that she could not escape, which was that she had nothing left to lose. When a female CEO agreed to give 2 little girls 15 minutes to save her empire, she could not imagine what kind of chain reaction that single choice was about to unleash. When a janitor stepped through a doorway and saw his daughters surrounded by executives and glowing screens, he did not realize that his long-buried past was about to be dragged into the light in front of everyone. When those twins stretched their small hands toward the keyboard, they had no idea that one brave moment would pull a father out of a sea of guilt that had almost swallowed him and would begin to thaw a woman who had almost forgotten what it felt like to feel anything real at all. If you are already leaning in, wondering whether 2 children can truly stand in the gap where an army of experts failed, then pause for a heartbeat and tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from. Because we love seeing these stories travel across continents and into different lives. And while you are here, if stories about impossible odds, second chances, and unlikely heroes resonate with you, then hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to remember that hope can show up from the most unexpected places. Because what these 2 little girls do next might stay with you for a very long time. 37 minutes earlier, Kimberly had been in her corner office reviewing quarterly projections, wrapped in the calm, controlled ritual that made her feel secure. She sat perfectly composed in a tailored suit, her long, curly blonde hair swept into an immaculate low bun, every item on her desk aligned, every figure in her report measured and predictable. The city stretched beneath her windows, like a neatly organized spreadsheet. And for a moment, she believed that everything in her world was as tightly controlled as the numbers in front of her, until the office door flew open without a knock and shattered that illusion. Her CTO rushed in with his face drained of color until it resembled old newspaper left too long in the sun, and his voice came out tight and strained as he told her that the company had been hacked and that this was not a minor breach but something catastrophic. The operations center felt like the heart of a ship, taking on water faster than anyone could bail it out. The air smelled faintly of coffee and stress. Screens glowed with angry red alerts, and 10 specialists hunched over keyboards with shoulders tense and fingers trembling while they worked at frantic speed. Their eyes were locked onto lines of shifting code as if they were staring down a living creature, while sweat gathered on their foreheads despite the air conditioning that usually kept the room as cold as a server rack. The virus they were fighting looked horrifyingly elegant, a sophisticated piece of malicious art that slipped through their defenses and began draining client assets at a pace that made Kimberly feel physically sick. As she watched the numbers race upward on the main display like a countdown, she could not stop. She demanded a status update in a voice that carried the weight of every sleepless night she had poured into this company, and her lead engineer, with his throat dry and his confidence crumbling, admitted that they could not isolate the intruder. The code kept rewriting itself every time they tried to corner it, each countermeasure they pushed into the system becoming obsolete almost instantly as the virus shifted shape and adapted, until he finally admitted that they had never seen anything like this before. Kimberly watched the financial damage escalate, watched $3 billion evaporate on the screen while some of the best minds in cybersecurity scrambled and failed to stop it. And in that moment, all the sacrifices she had made over the years started to feel like they were being mocked. She thought of the relationships she had let wither, the friendships she had allowed to die, the nights she had chosen email over dinner and boardrooms over birthdays. And suddenly it was as if all of those lost moments and broken promises were being tallied in real time, while she stood there helpless, watching her empire bleed out in front of her. On that same Tuesday morning, in a very different corner of the same building, a man named Martin Ashford was arriving at work at an hour that did not belong to him. He usually worked the night shift, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., pushing his mop down quiet hallways and cleaning offices that would be repopulated by executives long after he had gone home. That day, however, a colleague had called in sick and asked for help, and Martin, because he was the kind of man who struggled to say no when someone was in real need, had agreed to cover the afternoon. His twin daughters had treated the news like a surprise holiday. All morning they had buzzed around him with irrepressible energy, asking again and again if this meant they would finally be able to see where he worked. Emma had bounced on her toes as she begged him to say yes, and Ella had added her own relentless chorus, her ginger curls bobbing every time she insisted that they would behave if he took them along. It was their school break. They had been asking to visit his workplace for weeks, and Martin was slowly running out of excuses that did not sound like fear. Eventually, he gave in, because denying them a small adventure felt harder than facing whatever discomfort might wait for him at the office in daylight. At 8:30 that morning, he walked through the gleaming lobby with Emma on one side and Ella on the other, their matching backpacks making them look like mirror images marching into some grand mission. The building felt strange to him at that hour, filled with people in sharp suits moving at a brisk pace, printers humming, phones ringing, and an almost physical sense of productivity buzzing in the air, which was a sharp contrast to the quiet, echoing corridors he usually cleaned at night. He led the twins to the janitor's small break room on the second floor, a cramped space with a worn couch, a scratched table, and a coffee maker that looked like it had survived several corporate rebrands. Kneeling down so he was eye level with them, he gave simple and serious instructions, telling them to stay put while he grabbed supplies from storage, promising that he would be right back, and repeating that they should not wander under any circumstances. Emma answered with solemn assurance that they would stay, and Ella traced an invisible cross over her heart to seal the promise. Martin kissed both girls on their foreheads and stepped into the hallway, carrying the quiet hope that for once a simple request might actually hold. The promise lasted less than 5 minutes. Emma cocked her head toward the door when she heard the first distant ripple of raised voices and hurried footsteps. Ella heard it too, the kind of tension that does not need words to communicate fear, a crackle in the air that felt wrong. Ella said they should stay where they were, but even as she spoke, she was already standing up, drawn by curiosity and a sense that something important was happening. Emma agreed that they would just take a quick look, nothing more, and the twins slipped out of the break room and followed the sound upward, their small sneakers soft on the stairs, while the intensity of the noise grew with every floor. By the time they reached the level that housed the operations center, the corridor vibrated with energy. Voices overlapped in urgent tones, keyboards clattered, and somewhere a printer spat out paper that no one bothered to collect. The twins stopped at the threshold of a massive room filled with enormous screens, each one covered in flowing code that looked to them less like chaos and more like a puzzle begging to be solved. In the center of it all stood a woman with blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, her face pale and drawn, her hands clenched so hard that the knuckles had gone white, as though she were physically trying to hold her world together by sheer force of will. Emma and Ella understood more than anyone expected two 8-year-old girls to understand. They recognized the patterns and the frantic attempts to keep up with them, the error messages and the scrambled fail-safes, and they recognized the hollow dread in the room that meant the adults believed they were losing. They saw not just a cyber attack, but an intelligent, shifting predator inside a system that was supposed to be safe, and they could tell from the way everyone moved that this predator was winning. They shared that wordless twin conversation with a single glance, the one that carried questions and answers without sound. Should we step in, or will they laugh at us? What if no one listens and we only make things worse? What will Dad say if he finds out we disobeyed him and interfered in something this big? Then they remembered one particular evening months earlier, when they had been walking home and had seen an elderly man struggling with heavy grocery bags, and how their father had immediately gone over to help without being asked, telling them that whenever they had the ability to help, they should do it, because that was what made them truly human. That memory tipped the scales. They stepped into the room. Ella reached up and tugged gently at the sleeve of the blonde woman who was clearly in charge. Kimberly looked down, startled that anyone dared approach her in the middle of this crisis, let alone two small girls with ginger curls and backpacks. They were so completely out of place in a room that felt like a war zone that for a second her brain simply refused to process what she was seeing. She snapped, demanding to know who they were and how they had gotten in, her voice razor-sharp with fear dressed up as anger. The girls replied that they could help, and when Kimberly repeated their words back to them in disbelief, Emma pointed at the main screen and said that they could stop the virus. For several long seconds, Kimberly just stared at these children, who looked like they belonged in an elementary school classroom rather than at the center of a corporate meltdown, and she could barely believe they were serious. She tried to shut them down, explaining in a flat, dangerous tone that this was not a game, that there were billions of dollars at stake, and that they needed to tell her where their parents were and how they got past security. Emma replied quickly that their father worked in the building and was just getting supplies, but she begged Kimberly to listen because they really could help, then described the malware as a polymorphic worm with recursive encryption that was brilliant, but not perfect, because it still followed a pattern if you knew where to look. One of the senior engineers spun around when he heard that, because the jargon sounded like it belonged in a specialized research paper, rather than coming from the mouth of a child. Ella calmly explained that the virus was rewriting itself every 37 seconds, and that this constant mutation was the reason the team could not pin it down. Yet, while the active code kept changing, it left behind faint signatures in system memory every time it moved. If they stopped chasing the live infection and instead tracked those ghost footprints, they could predict its next appearance and build a digital cage around the space it would occupy. The entire room fell into a stunned silence that felt heavier than any shouting had. Heads turned one by one toward the twins, eyes widening as everyone registered what they had just heard, because two 8-year-old girls were now speaking about advanced cybersecurity with the ease and precision of seasoned experts. Kimberly repeated that their father worked in the building and asked again what he did, almost afraid of the answer. Emma said simply that he was a janitor who usually worked nights and that he was covering for someone that day. The CTO stepped closer as if he needed to see them more clearly, asked their age, and received the perfectly synchronized answer of 8, which somehow made the entire situation even more surreal. Someone from the cluster of engineers called out that they should let the girls try, that there was nothing left to lose at this point, and another voice muttered darkly that they had already lost everything that mattered. Kimberly's instinct screamed that allowing children to touch that keyboard was madness, a dangerous breach of protocol and common sense. Yet when she looked around the room, she saw nothing but exhausted faces and empty hands. They had tried everything they knew, and the numbers on the main screen were still jumping. In that split second, she made a decision that no leadership manual had ever prepared her for. She ordered them to be given a terminal. Emma and Ella moved toward the station as though they had been waiting their whole lives for this moment. They slid into the chair together, shoulders touching, and began working in a rhythm that had been built over countless late-night experiments. Their fingers danced over the keyboard in a blur while one of them typed and the other monitored, switching effortlessly, and finishing each other's half-formed thoughts out loud, in a strange dual commentary that the adults struggled to follow. Code began to pour across the screen, not as a desperate reaction but as a deliberate strategy, and the entire room held its breath, watching two children do what a room full of professionals had failed to achieve. The twins' faces were lit by the soft blue from the monitors, their expressions focused and unafraid, and to Kimberly it looked almost otherworldly, as if the building itself had summoned some secret weapon from a different world. Minutes dragged by with excruciating slowness. After 10 minutes, the financial hemorrhaging slowed in a way that could not be dismissed as coincidence, and a flicker of hope moved through the room like a low murmur. At 12 minutes, the virus began to falter and lose its grip on the system. After 15 intense minutes, the attack came to a halt, leaving $3 billion frozen but recoverable, the malicious code neutralized and contained by a trap that looked almost elegant in its simplicity when seen in hindsight. The operations center erupted into a storm of disbelief and relief. People stood up from their chairs as if they needed to prove they could still stand. Engineers crowded around the terminal to inspect the solution. Voices overlapped with fragments of praise and stunned questions about how the twins had come up with that approach so quickly. A voice cut through the noise, sharp and full of fear, calling out, "Emma! Ella!" In the doorway stood Martin Ashford in his janitor's uniform, holding a box of cleaning supplies that was now tilting dangerously in his hands, his face drained of color as he took in the scene. His daughters were surrounded by executives and glowing screens, and in that instant, he understood that they had broken their promise, and that the secret he had tried so desperately to bury might not stay hidden anymore. The box slipped from his hands, bottles and cloths clattering across the carpet while he rushed forward. The twins turned, and their faces shifted from triumph to something much smaller and more fragile. Kimberly saw fear there, not the fear of punishment in the usual childish sense, but a deeper, sharper fear of having disappointed the one person whose opinion mattered more than anyone else's, and a fear of adding to his pain. Emma began to apologize through a voice that trembled, saying they had been supposed to stay in the break room and had not meant to disobey, while Ella explained that they had only wanted to help when they heard all the noise and realized something terrible was happening. Martin did not shout. Instead, he crossed the space in 3 long strides and pulled both girls into his arms with such intensity that his entire body shook. Kimberly, who had expected anger and harsh words, watched in stunned silence as a man who usually slipped through her building unnoticed held onto his daughters as if they were the only solid thing left in his world. His voice, thick with emotion, told them that he was proud of them, intensely proud of both of them, and the twins dissolved into full-bodied sobs of relief against his chest as he told them that he would never be angry at them for using the gifts they had. He apologized for ever making them feel like they needed to hide who they were, and he admitted that his own pain had cast a shadow over their dreams, which was something he deeply regretted. Kimberly felt a strange twisting in her chest as she watched them, as if some long frozen part of her had been nudged awake, and she found herself trying to remember the last time anyone had looked at her with the open, unfiltered love that she was seeing on those, little faces and in that father's eyes. The CTO stepped forward and addressed Martin in a careful tone, saying that whoever he was, his daughters had just saved the company, and that they were among the most talented people any of them had ever seen. Before he could continue, another senior engineer interrupted, staring at Martin with an expression that mixed recognition and disbelief. He repeated Martin's name, almost as if testing whether the reality in front of him matched the legend in his memory, and then began to list the things Martin was known for, including designing a major security protocol and heading teams at a top defense firm. The engineer was halfway through stating that Martin had once been a legend in cybersecurity, when Martin quietly shut the conversation down by saying that this was not the time. His tone was polite, but his posture made it clear that he did not want to resurrect that part of his life in front of his daughters and dozens of strangers. He thanked them for allowing the girls to help and tried to steer Emma and Ella toward the exit. Kimberly could feel the moment slipping away, a moment she knew would not come again if she let it pass, so she called out and asked them to wait. The murmurs in the room faded again as she stepped forward, her heels clicking on the polished floor that his mop had cleaned countless times. She told Martin that his daughters had just saved everything she had spent years building, and that the least she could do was thank them properly. She invited them to dinner the following night, insisting that she wanted to celebrate what the twins had done. Martin tried to refuse, saying it was unnecessary, but she looked directly at the girls and saw the hope in their eyes as they imagined pizza or dessert in a bright place, instead of a quiet break room. She relaxed her tone, told them to call her Kimberly instead of Miss Caldwell, and repeated that she would not take no for an answer because what they had accomplished deserved more than a hurried thank you on the office floor. Martin hesitated, pulled between his instinct to protect their privacy and the visible excitement on his daughters' faces, until Emma whispered a soft, "Please, Daddy," and Ella reminded him that it was only dinner. He looked at his daughters, then at the CEO, whose voice had shifted from hard command to something warm and sincere, and something inside him loosened just enough for him to agree. He nodded once and said they would come. If you have felt the tension in this story begin to bend toward something softer, and if you are wondering how a single data breach could turn into a doorway that opens into healing for 4 different hearts, then take a moment before we move forward, make sure you have subscribed, tap the like button, and share this story with someone who needs a reminder that sometimes a disaster becomes the starting point for a completely different life. Because what begins as a simple dinner invitation is about to change everything for Kimberly, for Martin, and for 2 little girls who just wanted to help.